The study of institutional work was, perhaps not surprisingly, one of the animating forces for Nelson and myself behind the development of the social symbolic work perspective. I showed you the email on the first day that Nelson sent to me many, many, many years ago saying something is happening. And part of the observation was, we're kind of by tradition, most of what we've done in our careers has been organized around institutions, not only, but a lot of it. And so we're very aware of what's going on in institutional theory and institutional conversations. And what we were observing was these kind of parallel conversations going along in other areas of research around identity and around emotions and so on. And then we started to see even more, in some ways, focused kinds of research on particular kinds of work. Um, Now, when we look at the evolution of the study of institutional work, we see some kind of interesting things because when it first began, when we first started talking about institutional work, most of the research was really focused on identifying forms of institutional work. Look, here it is in this context, and here it is in another context. And that was quite useful and interesting. But then it evolved over time, over the last, say, 15 years, in I think a couple of different phases. The first phase, after the kind of identification of forms or development of lists of work, was the integration of different kinds of institutional work. So people started to look at the relationship between how institutions are created and how they were changed, or how they were maintained and how they were changed, or much more specific forms of institutional work within those categories as well. And then a second shift occurred kind of in parallel with that, but a little bit later, was this emergence of a focus on different kinds of objects and different kinds of work that were associated with but distinct from institutional work. So people started to look at emotions and identity, for instance, as objects in relationship to institutions, and also emotion work and identity work in relationship to institutional work. And people like Doug Creed and our guest Professor Zietsma have been central to that conversation. And all of those um, phases and shifts are important to us in terms of how we think about social symbolic work more generally. And so, one of the questions that comes up a lot and we'll address today a little bit is the relationship between institutional work and social symbolic work, and institutions and social symbolic objects. Now, there's a conceptual answer to those questions, which we'll deal with, but there's also a kind of um, research tradition perspectival kind of answer to those questions. And it also goes back to the question that was asked last time, I think, around, or the first day maybe, around the relationship between social construction and social symbolic work as a perspective. And one of the things we're going to talk about on Thursday, not to jump ahead too much, is the idea that one of the significant values in looking at social symbolic work is the opportunity to integrate across different kinds of work and across different kinds of objects, and a kind of sensitivity to the, um, in some ways, undefinable nature of social symbolic objects in any particular scene. So the idea being that you become sensitive to what are the objects in a scene, and you start to enumerate them, identify them, and look at the relationships between them. And in a way, that's what's happened in the study of institutional work. That it's become more of a perspective, it's become more of a way of looking at institutional processes and other objects and other forms of work. Okay, so let's step back a bit and talk about social symbolic objects, and in particular the idea of an institution as a social symbolic object. Now, one of the things we talked about previously was that when you look at um, this book or any paper you've read, and particularly a book you've sort of written or a paper you've written, there's sort of two ways of seeing it. One is as what you've created, the book or the paper, but then the other is the process that you went through to write it. And so when you look at your own papers, you see the process, that how you got there, all the drafts, all the revisions, all the rejections or whatever, the acceptances. And we're kind of the same way when we look at this book. It's hard to read and not remember all the processes that went through it. And for us, one of the big process parts of writing it came in looking at and trying to understand social symbolic objects as an idea, as opposed to work, because we came in with work as the idea. And then we realized we had to think about what the objects were. And it really became interesting for us trying to understand what was common across these objects, but also what was distinct between different kinds of objects. And so when we look at institutions as objects, we have a fairly simple definition that comes from the institutional literature that conventions are self-policing, or that institutions rather are conventions that are self-policing. And by these, we mean a shared social understanding of a practice, a technology, or rule, or other object. And the important part there is the shared social understanding. That's really the core kind of ontological claim about what an institution is from our perspective. And then the secondary claim is that those shared social understandings are subject to self-regulating controls that create pressure to act according to that understanding. And so, whereas we could have lots of understandings that you would only act on under duress or force. So I have children, um, and most of what I think are our shared understandings aren't really shared at all. They're just my understandings. And I have to threaten them to make it so that they'll comply with my understandings. So, what time is a reasonable time to come home? What should they be doing with their spare time? Why they should read my books? That kind of thing. They don't seem to go along with that. So those aren't institutions within the social system that is my family. The shared social understandings that are institutions are the ones that don't require that reinforcement, don't require those kind of cajoling or threats and so on. So we make an even simpler distinction in the book. The idea that when you compare institutions to organizations or selves or other objects, we think of institutions as the concept of a thing as opposed to the thing itself. And so there were lots of questions in the chat last time and even in the very first day around the distinction between organization work and institutional work, or self-work and institutional work. And this is where the difference hinges. This is the pivot point, is that self-work and organization work are work on organizations and selves. Institutional work would be work on the concept of the self, or the concept of a particular kind of organization, or the concept of even an organization. And so the work done to define those things. So one of the other claims we make in the book is that not only are these social symbolic objects comparable, institutions and organizations and selves and other targets of social symbolic work, but they also have a common, well, very broadly common history that is connected to the evolution of Western society, and especially to a couple of large transitions that Western society has gone through. We've talked about these already in relationship to the self and the organization, but I want to talk about them in terms of the institutions as well. And so uh, this is a kind of interesting issue for the study of institutions, because when we look at uh, the literature on institutions, we see many, many histories of institutions. But what they are is idiosyncratic histories of particular institutions over time. And what we see relatively little of is conversations that link the evolution across institutions. So from our perspective, though, there is a lot in common when you look at, for instance, the transition from pre-modern to modern. So institutions, so concepts that we think of as pre-modern, are ones that are endured. So they were obviously always institutions. They were taken for granted assumptions about the world, shared social understandings. That idea is not new, or that phenomenon is not new. But the difference between pre-modern and modern institutions is that pre-modern institutions were understood as emanating from nature or from God. These were not socially constructed ideas. These were uh, discovered or realized institutions that came from nature or God or some kind of cosmic sort of pinning that we couldn't change, that we couldn't do anything about. The shift to modernity came with a shift in our understanding of what institutions were and where they came from, and consequently what we could do about them. And so, in the shift to modernity, institutions in general shifted from this given from God status to the product of human effort. Um, and that had different implications. And one of the things, just to clarify as we go through this, is as with the self, as with organizations, what we're not suggesting is there's some point in time where we rejected pre-modern institutions and all institutions became modern. It's very much a layered process. So obviously, there are lots of shared social understandings today that we would describe as pre-modern, which is not a pejorative term. It's only meant to describe institutions that are understood as emanating from God or nature, or gods or nature. And so we think of modern institutions as those institutions largely born in the era of modernity. Uh, and so born over the sort of 200 or 300 years between the 1700s and the 1900s, that are thought of as potentially perfectible because they're constructed by uh, humankind rather than by God. And I'm going to give you an example in a minute and walk through it. And then lastly, the transition to postmodernity, say starting in about the 1950s, led to a very different kind of understanding of what social institutions were. So we had potentially perfectible progressive institutions coming out of modernity. And then we had, starting in the 1950s, and especially in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, an understanding of social institutions as a much more complex mix of action and circumstance, slightly chaotic, slightly the product of people's efforts, that were changeable but not perfectible. And so politics, rather than perfection, kind of became the anchor of change for institutions. So let me just give you an example, which is from the book that if you've looked at, you'll be familiar with. But a really interesting example is language. And so we think of language as, in some ways, both idiosyncratic, there are languages, but also transcendent in the sense that for a very, very long time in human history, language has been the driving force of evolution, social evolution particularly, but even evolution. And so, but what happened in the transition from pre-modern to modern sets of institutions is that the nature of language changed. And the nature of language changed from something which was not under our control to something that was under our control. And there was an effort that was aligned with the emergence of the nation state in Western history, that was very much about the construction of language and the identification of language with particular nation states. And there was a evolution of a thing called language planning that developed differently in different nation states, but uh, um, really emerged in the same broad historical period. And the picture is of the Dictionnaire de l'Académie Française, which is a kind of archetypal version of language planning, which occurred in France, and in fact still occurs in France. And the key to the Académie Française was that they would move to a perfectible form of French. I'm just gonna, 1 second. No, I can't, maybe if I can mute Kelly's thing. Anyway, sorry. The So there's a description in the book, but the idea of the Académie Française was to develop French as a perfectible language that would be ideal for the evolution and identified with the evolution of the state of France. And it was where these transitions came from was particularly evolution in Europe of a movement from Latin to local languages as the formal languages of the court, of commerce, and so on. A similar thing happened in the UK. In the UK, there was a movement from French to English as the formal language. But the problem with English was there were so many dialects, they simply had to choose one. So they chose the South Midlands dialect, which was largely the language of London and the courts and commerce, and it became formalized in that way. Now we skip ahead to the middle of the 20th century, in particular the 60s and 70s, And there was a real change in the institution of language that's reflected in a couple of different dynamics. One of which was that language became commodifiable as style. And so previous to postmodernity, language was something that was perfectible. And consequently, if you look at someone like Orwell writing about language, the aim in the use of language and what was seen as better use of language was a language that didn't get in the way, that didn't interfere with the ideas behind it. The postmodern understanding of language is what's often talked about as a post-representational understanding of language, one that is related to ideas, but not sitting on top of and separate from ideas. And so we think about what are often called the culture wars, in particular starting in the US, but now in the UK and elsewhere, and the dynamics around language, particularly in relationship to things like gender and race, and discussions of appropriate and inappropriate uses of language. The point in those conversations is not that there is a perfectible or inevitable progression in the use of language. The point is that there are political and aesthetic consequences of using language in particular ways, in particular communities, in relationship to particular people. And so we have this whole arc from language as an institution which is enduring and coming from God or nature to a perfectible, plannable understanding of language as an institution to one that is much more chaotic and political. And what we see if we look across um, different institutions, if you look across science, commerce, government, these different broad institutional categories, if you were a logics person, you might see them as kinds of logics. They've gone through similar kind of arcs over those periods. Okay, so from science to the Gulabi Gang, this is just an example to get us into, anchor us in terms of the discussion of institutional work. So we've talked about what institutions are, and an important part of going through that evolution of institutions was the idea that different conceptions of institutions provide the possibility of different kinds of institutional work. And so if you think of institutions as perfectible, the work you would do on them would be like the Académie Française, where it's planning, progress driven, making things more codified. If you think of language as more political or aesthetic, then the kinds of work you would do would be driven by that. And so the Gulabi Gang is an interesting one because it really is anchored in a nested set of understandings of institution, which include everything from pre-modern to postmodern. Um, what they are is the world's largest women's vigilante group. They began in one of the poorest regions of Uttar Pradesh, and what makes them an instance of institutional work is their work that they do to counter understandings of appropriate and inappropriate relationships between men and women. The way they do that includes a lot of self-work and organization work, which includes very physical and material kinds of things like smearing abusive men with chili powder, beating men with lathis, which are the batons carried by local police officers, doing marches. The wearing of the pink is a part of their discursive work that they're doing. And so the reason we want to use it is because it kind of cuts across these different dimensions of institutional work, which we want to focus on today. Get rid of these transitions, which we don't need. When we talk about institutional work, one of the things we want to emphasize is that includes discursive and relational material dimensions to it. And the point here is not that there is discursive institutional work and relational institutional work and material institutional work. From our perspective, all social symbolic objects have all three of these dimensions, including institutions. So we said institutions were conceptual, but they also have significant material components. How are they transmitted? Where are they embedded? How are they enacted? So if you think about the pink saris as part of the work that the Gulabi Gang is doing, those pink saris are both part of the organization work they do to define themselves, but they're also part of the expression of what they're trying to accomplish. If we start with the discursive, it's very straightforward. We think of institutions as primarily cognitive and discursive phenomena. And so discourse is central to their construction and maintenance. But all social symbolic objects exist in social systems and are only meaningful in terms of the relationships in which they're embedded. The material aspect also comes in both to the work and to the objects themselves. And two questions came out from this discussion around institutional work in particular. One of which was what distinguishes social symbolic objects from institutions? And this is a really common question. And it also relates to the idea of what distinguishes, there's two questions in some ways embedded here. What distinguishes the idea of an institution from the idea of a social symbolic object in general? And then what distinguishes an institution as a concept or as a kind of object from other kinds of objects? And so in the first part, we would say that we think of all institutions as kinds of social symbolic objects. And I think, there's a real significant implication here for institutional theory. And I don't think it's going to happen overnight. But I think the study of institutions has run into significant difficulties because it is so anchored to the concept of an institution, when what a lot of people who are, in quotes, institutional scholars want to study are not necessarily institutions. And so one of the things Nelson has said is that what institutional theory often is a way for organizational scholars to look at processes of social construction. And we do it using institutional theory as a way in, but because we do it that way, we end up kind of running up onto the rocks because we always have to focus or identify what's the institution in question, when sometimes we would be much better off articulating what's the object in question that we're trying to understand the social construction of. So that's one part of the answer. The second part of the answer is, okay, so if all institutions are objects, not all objects are institutions, and what's the difference between them? So for us, the difference between them is somewhat analogous to in discourse analysis or critical discourse analysis. They make the distinction between concepts and objects. And as confusedly as we do, they call both of those objects. And so from our perspective, we try and avoid the kind of naming, labeling problem. And we talk about different kinds of objects, with institutions being a conceptual form of an object, in the sense that from our perspective, organizations, Ford, Tesla, University of Oxford, are organizations. And they're all instances of broader categories, which are the institutions of car companies, universities, and so on. Oxford's a funny example because there's also Oxbridge, which is Oxford and Cambridge, which together you can think of as an institution in the sense of there's the idea of Oxbridge, but then there's actually the practical reality of the organizations as objects in everyday existence that people work on. And so from an institutional perspective, you might work on the idea of what Oxford is. So you might write a novel about Oxford, which lots of people have done. And in doing that, you might even intentionally work on the concept of what is that university. But then equally, lots of my colleagues are involved in the practical organizational work of creating and recreating us as an object over time. So that's the difference. The difference between objects and concepts is analogous for us between all other forms of social symbolic objects and institutions as social symbolic objects. Okay, so what does that mean for the relationship between institutional work and social symbolic work? And this is where it goes back to really this idea that institutional work has really become overstretched in its application, where institutional work has been used to describe things that I don't think are institutional work. Now, I don't get to review actually every paper that is published on institutional work. But if I did, I would reject a bunch of them because I don't actually think that they're actually studying institutions or institutional work. They're studying the creation of a self, an organization, different kinds of objects which are not institutions. Okay. Okay. Before I go past that. Actually, any questions about that, or are you answering them all in chat, Nelson?
They haven't. You seem to be very convincing because there hasn't been a lot of questions. You clearly your explanations are so powerful that there are no
I think it's
questions.
convincing or confusing. So
Whether they're completely afraid or that's one of them.
yeah. So that could be. So let's talk about different kinds of institutional work, and that might either clarify or not what we mean by institutional work. So in the book, we talk about two kinds of institutional work: practice work and category work. Practice work is by far the dominant form of institutional work in terms of the research that's been done on it. And I think that comes from a number of different um, sources, one of which is just the practical nature of where we are. So we're in business schools studying organizations. And so a lot of what we study is how stuff gets done by organizations. And we tend to look at the practices through which those get done. If you were in a law school, for instance, studying the sociology of law, you might be more likely to look at laws as institutions and regulations as institutions much more. And we do that, but we do much more around practices. Um, One question that we run into, and we don't run into it as much as we used to, but is the question of whether all practices are institutions. And so from a traditional institutional scholarship position, and you would get this answer from lots of um, very sophisticated institutional scholars, they would say that no, not all practices are institutions. Uh, and their answer would be that not all practices are widely diffused, taken for granted, particularly at the field level. From our perspective, practices are all institutions to the extent that they exist as some kind of idea of the practice. To the extent that there's some abstract understanding of what people are engaged in, then as a practice that it counts for us as an institution. And so we can think about institutionalization less as how widely is it diffused, um, and more as to what degree does it exist as an abstract concept that is kind of overarching some more concrete object. Okay. Um, so this ends up having a kind of complex relationship between practice theory and practice work. And so we talk about practice work, and not all practice theory scholars are super comfortable with that. For us, it's not very complicated. There are practices, and you can do work. All work uses practices, uses repertoire as a practice, but some work works on practices, and so there's a recursive relationship between them. So if I give a seminar, I'm obviously enacting a repertoire of practices right now. But I'm also doing, if I do it in some innovative, creative way, intentionally to diffuse or establish a new way of giving a seminar, then I would be doing practice work. I'd be doing work on the practice of giving a seminar. So maybe I write a book on how to give seminars. That would be practice work, and the practice in question would be giving seminars. Simply to give it a seminar would not necessarily be practice work, but it would obviously be enacting a practice. And so my aim here was to see how many times in 3 minutes I could say the word practice, and I think I've probably accomplished my aim. Okay. So this is Nelson had great success with his quiz. He showed you a picture of a car in space and said, "What is this?" So this is my question. What is this? So you have to put your answers in chat. What do you think this is? Jail, a business incubator, a green room, a study room, a hair salon. You should know that I would never put a hair salon.
I can imagine that being a hair salon. Yeah.
But you would know I would never put a hair salon. Like, when was the last time I was in a hair salon? Backstage theater, COVID safe study space. Excellent. Jordan wins. So this is a supervised injection room. It's Insight, which is in Vancouver. It's a supervised injection room for heroin and cocaine users. But it's not actually incidental that it looks like a hair salon or a study space. Part of the reason it's formulated the way it is to make it look unthreatening to everyone involved, both for people who use it, people who work there, but also people who take tours of it. A lot of people take tours of this particular space each year. This was the first supervised injection or first government sanctioned supervised injection site for cocaine and heroin users in North America. And now there's a bunch more in Canada as well. The reason I put it up is because it's simultaneously an organization and an institution. The organization is Insight, and it runs this supervised injection site. The idea of a supervised consumption room or a supervised injection site is the institution, and the idea of it, which didn't start in Vancouver, obviously, there were consumption sites in Switzerland and Germany, the Netherlands before that existed in Canada, and a study I did was the translation of that idea, that institution, from one geographic sphere into another, and the translation of that institution into an organization, into an object of a concrete kind rather than a conceptual kind. And if you think about those dimensions we talked about, the discursive and relational and material, you can start to kind of imagine how doing work to translate a concept of one geography to another involves all those dimensions. And so um, this is the first government supervised injection site in Vancouver, but there were actually 6 injection sites before this one, some illegal, some just on paper, a couple that were demonstration sites, all of which were used both to kind of address concrete problems, but also to kind of develop and redefine what the concept of an institution of an injection site was. So that involved trying it out, seeing how it would work, um, using a room, seeing how many people would be there, coming up with rules, etc. And so all those different dimensions of institutional work ended up creating this new practice. So here's the second kind of institutional work we talk about in the book is category work. And this is actually, I think, still an area which has a great deal of scope to be explored. The idea of categories is not new, but categories have traditionally been explored primarily from more of an ecological basis in organization studies. And only more recently, about the last 10 years, have people started to look at it from more from an institutional perspective, and particularly from a category work perspective. So this is where it's focused really on the distinctions between particular objects or including different kinds of people. The research is really tied, especially to cognitive and discursive conceptions of these categories, but I think you could do really interesting work on the material and relational boundaries that are in play. One of the missing things in this research is it tends to look on, or tends to imagine categories as relatively isolated and focus on specific boundaries. So, for instance, the boundary between light cigarettes and other cigarettes was one of the focus. What's missing in that kind of research is the idea that these categories exist in fairly complex networks of categories, and including objects and other kinds of work, all of which animate the category in question. So we tend to think of boundaries as like a line, and on this side there's one object, and this side there's another object. In reality, you can think of as a kind of n-dimensional space where more like language, where you imagine if you take a kind of relational understanding of language, the meaning of all words is only in relationship to other words. The same is true of categories. The relationship of categories is always in relationship to nested networks of other categories, both in space and in time, over time.